The community center smelled like old coffee and floor wax when Margaret Chen walked through the glass doors that Tuesday evening. She wore a simple blue sweater and dark jeans, the kind of outfit you'd see on any mother picking up groceries. Her black hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, and she carried a worn canvas bag that had seen better days. Margaret paused at the reception desk, checking the paper in her hand twice before heading down the hallway. The sound of piano music drifted from room 104, and she could hear voices laughing and chatting inside. She took a deep breath and knocked gently on the doorframe. "Excuse me, is this the adult beginner piano class?" The man at the piano looked up with a polite but hurried smile. He was probably in his 30s, wearing a crisp white shirt and tie like he'd just come from an office job. His name tag read, "Robert Wilson, Instructor." "Yes, come on in. You must be Margaret." "I'm Robert, your teacher." He gestured toward a corner of the room where several digital keyboards were set up. "Just grab any open spot over there. We're just getting started." Margaret nodded and made her way to an empty keyboard in the back corner. The room buzzed with nervous energy as about 15 other students settled into their spots. There was Betty, a grandmother with silver hair who kept adjusting her reading glasses. Next to her sat David, a young man in his 20s who looked like he'd rushed straight from work. Across the room, Linda chatted excitedly with her friend Patricia about finally having time for hobbies now that their kids were older. A few teenagers sat together, probably fulfilling some school requirement. Everyone seemed eager and a little nervous. Margaret quietly unpacked her things, just a simple notebook and a pen. She noticed others had brought music books, fancy cases, and even recording devices. She felt a small smile tug at her lips as she watched Robert try to organize the enthusiastic but chaotic group. "All right, everyone, let's start with the basics," Robert announced, clapping his hands together. "Piano is all about patience and practice. Some of you might have played a little before, but we're starting from square one." He demonstrated proper sitting posture, how to curve your fingers, and where to place your hands on the keys. Margaret watched carefully, occasionally glancing around at her classmates who were all trying to copy his movements. "The most important thing," Robert continued, "is not to expect too much too soon. Piano takes years to master. Even simple songs require months of practice." Margaret nodded along with everyone else, keeping her hands folded in her lap. When Robert asked if anyone had questions, she raised her hand tentatively. "Should we be pressing the keys hard or soft?" "Great question," Robert beamed. "Start gentle. Heavy hands are a beginner's biggest mistake." As the lesson continued, Robert taught them about the musical alphabet and how to find middle C. Margaret followed along, occasionally asking simple questions that made Robert nod approvingly. She seemed like the perfect student, attentive but not overeager, humble but not afraid to participate. During the break, Betty struck up a conversation. "Have you ever played before, dear?" Margaret shook her head with a shy smile. "Not really. I used to pick out simple songs on my grandmother's old piano when I was little, but nothing serious." "Well, you seem to be catching on quickly," David added, overhearing from nearby. "Some of us are still trying to remember which finger goes where." Margaret laughed softly. "I think I'm just good at following directions. My kids always said I was too careful about everything." "How many children do you have?" Linda asked, joining their small circle. "Two. They're both in college now. Finally have time for myself again." Margaret's eyes lit up when talking about her kids. "My daughter always wanted me to learn piano. She said it would be good for me." The group nodded knowingly. Several of them were in similar situations, empty nesters looking for new adventures. When class resumed, Robert had them practice finding different notes and playing simple scales. Margaret approached each exercise methodically, making the same small mistakes as everyone else. She asked about fingering for scales and nodded thoughtfully when Robert explained about muscle memory. "Remember," Robert said as the class wound down, "practice a little bit every day. Even 15 minutes helps. And don't get frustrated if it feels awkward at first. Everyone starts somewhere." He handed out practice sheets with basic exercises. Margaret looked at hers carefully as if studying something completely new. "Next week we'll start learning our first simple song," Robert announced. "Something easy that will make you feel like real pianists." As students began packing up, Margaret took her time, carefully folding her practice sheet and putting away her notebook. She said goodbye to her new classmates, promising to see them next week. Betty patted her arm gently. "You're going to do just fine, dear." I can tell you have good instincts." Margaret thanked her warmly and headed toward the door. As she walked down the hallway, she could hear Robert chatting with a few students who stayed behind, already discussing their goals and dreams for playing piano. Outside, the evening air was cool and refreshing. Margaret walked slowly to her car, thinking about the lesson. The other students seemed so genuine and excited. Robert was enthusiastic, if a bit formal in his teaching style. She sat in her car for a moment before starting the engine, watching through the community center windows as the last few students emerged, still talking animatedly about piano. For the first time in years, she felt truly anonymous. Not the accomplished musician everyone expected things from. Not the mother always managing everyone else's lives. Just Margaret, a beginner learning something new. As she drove home through the quiet suburban streets, she found herself humming a simple melody. Something basic enough that a true beginner might know it, but beautiful enough to make her smile. Tomorrow she would practice her exercises on the small digital keyboard she'd bought specifically for this class, carefully keeping her real piano covered and silent. For now, she was exactly who she appeared to be, a middle-aged woman taking her first tentative steps into the world of music, one careful note at a time. 3 weeks into the piano lessons, Margaret had become everyone's favorite classmate. She arrived early each Tuesday, always carrying a small tin of homemade cookies or muffins that she quietly placed on the side table. "Just something I made too much of," she'd say with a gentle shrug when people thanked her. During warm-up exercises, Margaret played her scales with careful concentration, making the same small stumbles that Robert expected from beginners. She'd pause occasionally, looking down at her fingers as if reminding herself which one to use next. Sometimes she'd hit a wrong note and scrunch up her face in the universal expression of, "Oops." "Don't worry about it," Robert would say encouragingly. "Muscle memory takes time to develop." Margaret would nod gratefully as if this concept was completely new to her. The truth was, her fingers knew these scales so well they could play them in her sleep. Instead, she had to concentrate intensely to make believable mistakes, hitting B-flat instead of B natural, or using her thumb when she should use her pinky. Betty had claimed the keyboard next to Margaret's, and the two had developed a sweet friendship. During breaks, Betty would share stories about her grandchildren, while Margaret listened with genuine interest, asking questions and offering gentle advice. "You're such a good listener, dear," Betty told her one evening. "Most people just wait for their turn to talk." Margaret smiled, thinking how many years of interviews and conversations about her own career had taught her the value of really hearing others. "I find people's stories fascinating. Everyone has such different experiences." David, the young office worker, often struggled with reading music. Margaret had developed a talent for explaining things in simple terms that helped him understand. "Think of it like reading words," she suggested during one lesson when he was frustrated with note recognition. "Eventually, you stop sounding out each letter and just see the whole word. Music works the same way." "That actually makes sense," David said, looking relieved. "You should be a teacher." Margaret laughed softly. "Oh, I don't think I know enough for that. I'm still learning myself." But she had noticed Robert watching her sometimes during these moments. Not suspiciously exactly, but with a slightly puzzled expression. Margaret was careful to balance her helpfulness with continued demonstrations of her own limitations. During the 4th week, Robert introduced them to their first real song, Twinkle, Twinkle Little Star in the key of C major. Simple enough for genuine beginners, but Margaret had to resist the urge to play it with the kind of expression and dynamics that would make even a children's song beautiful. Instead, she played it slowly and deliberately, counting out loud like the others. 1, 2, 3, 4, she murmured, pressing each key with careful attention. She made sure to pause between notes sometimes, as if double-checking that she was playing the right thing. "Excellent, Margaret," Robert said during one of her practice attempts. "You're really getting the hang of reading music." "It's starting to make more sense," she replied, looking pleased but not overly confident. "Though I still have to think about every single note." Linda and Patricia, the two friends who joined together, were having a harder time. They kept getting their fingers tangled up and dissolving into giggles when they made mistakes. "I feel like my hands belong to someone else," Patricia complained during break time. Margaret offered encouragement. "It felt impossible to me at first, too." "But Robert's right about the practice. Even just a few minutes each day really does help." "How much do you practice at home?" Linda asked. Maybe 20 minutes on the days I can manage it, Margaret answered honestly. She did practice for about 20 minutes on her small digital keyboard each day, the slow, careful practice of a beginner. Her real practice sessions on her grand piano were a completely different matter, but those didn't count for this conversation. I bought a little keyboard for my apartment, she continued. Nothing fancy, but it works for learning the basics. As the weeks progressed, Margaret found herself genuinely enjoying the social aspect of the class. These people were becoming real friends, not just fellow musicians or professional contacts. They shared stories about their families, their jobs, their hopes for retirement or career changes. Betty talked about wanting to play hymns at her church. David dreamed of eventually playing popular songs at parties. Linda and Patricia just wanted to have fun together and maybe surprise their families at Christmas. What about you, Margaret? Robert asked one evening. What's your musical goal? Margaret considered the question carefully. I think I just want to be able to play something beautiful, something that would make my children proud when they visit. The answer was true in its way. She did want her children to be proud, though they already were, and for different reasons than anyone in this room could imagine. Robert nodded approvingly. That's a lovely goal, very achievable with consistent practice. During the 6th week, Robert announced that they'd be learning a slightly more challenging piece, Ode to Joy by Beethoven, simplified for beginners. Margaret felt a flutter of nervousness, not because the piece was difficult, but because she knew it so well in its original form. She watched as Robert demonstrated the simplified version, nodding along as if hearing the melody for the first time. When it was her turn to try, she approached it with the same methodical care she'd shown with Twinkle, Twinkle. But something magical happened as she played, even in her deliberately simplified way. The beauty of Beethoven's composition shone through despite her careful restraint. The melody soared just enough to make Betty sigh with pleasure. Oh my, Betty whispered. That gave me chills. Margaret looked surprised, as if she hadn't expected that reaction. Really? I thought I made a lot of mistakes. Mistakes don't matter when you play with feeling, Robert said. And Margaret caught something thoughtful in his expression. Some people have a natural musicality that goes beyond technical accuracy. Margaret felt a small stab of worry. Was she being too expressive? She made a mental note to be more mechanical in her playing, more obviously focused on just hitting the right notes. After class that night, as Margaret packed up her things, David approached her with a question that made her heart skip. Margaret, can I ask you something? Were you being modest when you said you only played a little as a child? Because sometimes when you play, it sounds like, well, like you really understand the music. Margaret's mind raced, but she kept her expression calm and slightly confused. I don't think so. I mean, I've always loved listening to music. Maybe that helps? My mother used to play classical records all the time when I was growing up. David nodded, seeming satisfied with the explanation. That makes sense. You probably have a good ear from all that listening. As Margaret drove home that night, she realized she was walking a very fine line. Her love for music was so deep, so much a part of who she was, that it leaked through even when she tried to contain it. She would have to be more careful. But as she pulled into her driveway and saw the warm lights of her small house, she felt genuinely happy. For the first time in years, she was making friends who liked her for who she seemed to be in the moment, not for what she'd accomplished in the past or what she might do in the future. Just Margaret, learning piano, bringing cookies, and discovering that being ordinary could be its own kind of extraordinary. The announcement came during their 8th week of classes, just as everyone was getting comfortable with simple melodies and basic scales. Robert clapped his hands together with unusual excitement, his eyes bright with an idea that would change everything. I have wonderful news, everyone, he said, his voice carrying across the room. The community center is hosting its annual talent showcase next month, and our piano class has been invited to participate. A collective murmur of excitement and nervousness rippled through the group. Betty clasped her hands together, while David looked slightly pale. Linda and Patricia exchanged glances that seemed to say both, how exciting and oh no at the same time. Margaret felt her stomach tighten, but she kept her expression interested and mildly curious, like everyone else. Now don't worry, Robert continued, raising his hands to calm the rising chatter. This isn't a competition. It's just a chance for our community to see what you've learned and celebrate your progress. Each of you will perform a short piece that matches your current skill level. He walked over to his desk and picked up a stack of sheet music. I've selected pieces for each of you based on how you've been progressing. These are challenging enough to show growth, but not so difficult that you'll feel overwhelmed. One by one, he called students forward and handed them their showcase pieces. Betty received Amazing Grace in a simplified arrangement. David got a basic version of The Entertainer. Linda and Patricia were both assigned Mary Had a Little Lamb with simple harmonies. When Robert reached the end of his list, Margaret realized he hadn't called her name yet. She sat quietly, watching as her classmates examined their new music with expressions ranging from excitement to mild panic. "Margaret," Robert finally said, turning to face her with a look she couldn't quite read, "I've saved something special for you." He approached her keyboard with sheet music in his hand, but instead of the simple arrangements he'd given the others, this looked much more complex. Margaret could see multiple staffs, intricate note patterns, and dynamic markings that definitely didn't belong in a beginner's repertoire. "I'm giving you Chopin's Minute Waltz," Robert announced, setting the music on her stand with what appeared to be pride but felt more like a challenge. The room went completely silent. Even the students who didn't know much about classical music recognized that name, Chopin. And those who did know music understood exactly how difficult this piece was. "Robert," Betty said gently, "isn't that a bit advanced?" Margaret stared at the sheet music, her heart pounding. The familiar notation looked back at her, a piece she'd performed countless times in concert halls around the world. A piece that required years of training to execute properly. A piece that had no business being assigned to someone who'd been playing piano for 8 weeks. "I know it seems challenging," Robert said, his tone taking on a slight edge that Margaret had never heard before. "But I believe Margaret has been holding back. Sometimes we need to push our students out of their comfort zones to help them reach their potential." Margaret looked up at him, trying to keep her expression confused rather than alarmed. Are you sure? This looks really complicated. Maybe something simpler would be better?" "Nonsense," Robert replied, his smile not quite reaching his eyes. "You've been progressing faster than you realize. Your rhythm is excellent, your note reading is improving rapidly, and you clearly have musical instincts. I think it's time to challenge yourself." David leaned over to get a look at Margaret's music and whistled low. "Wow, that looks intense. Are you sure you want to tackle something that big?" Margaret felt trapped. If she protested too much, it might seem strange. After all, Robert was the teacher, and shouldn't a student trust their instructor's judgment? But if she accepted too readily, it would raise questions about why she felt confident about such a difficult piece. "I trust Robert's judgment," she said finally, her voice carefully measured, "though I have to admit I'm pretty nervous about it. Will I have enough time to learn it?" "The showcase is in 4 weeks," Robert said. "That should be plenty of time if you practice diligently. And remember, it's called the Minute Waltz because it's supposed to be played quickly. But there's no rule saying you have to perform it at full tempo. Take it as slowly as you need to." Patricia raised her hand tentatively. "Robert, I've heard this piece before. Isn't it really, really hard? Even for advanced players?" Robert's expression tightened slightly. "It's challenging, yes, but not impossible. I believe in pushing my students to exceed their own expectations. Margaret has shown remarkable aptitude, and I think she's been underestimating herself." Margaret could feel the uncomfortable tension in the room. Her classmates were looking at her with a mixture of sympathy and bewilderment. They'd all been struggling with much simpler pieces, and here Robert was essentially throwing her to the wolves. "What if I can't learn it in time?" Margaret asked, playing the role of a concerned beginner. "I don't want to embarrass myself or the class." "You won't embarrass anyone," Robert said firmly. "And if you find it truly beyond your current abilities, we can always simplify it or choose something else. But I want you to try first." Betty reached over and patted Margaret's hand sympathetically. "Don't worry, dear. We'll all help you practice during break times if you want." The gesture was so kind and sincere that Margaret felt a pang of guilt about her deception. These people genuinely cared about her, while Robert seemed to be setting her up for failure for reasons she couldn't understand. "Could you play a little bit of it for us?" Linda asked Robert. "So we can hear what it's supposed to sound like?" Robert moved to the piano and played the opening measures of the piece. His technique was competent but mechanical, lacking the nuance and expression that brought the composition to life. Still, even his basic interpretation was clearly beyond anything the class had attempted. When he finished, the room was quiet again. "See?" Patricia whispered to Margaret. That's beautiful, but it looks impossible. Margaret nodded, studying the music as if seeing it for the first time. In reality, she was noticing how Robert's interpretation missed several important phrasing opportunities and dynamic contrasts that made the piece truly shine. "I'll do my best," she said aloud. "Maybe I can at least learn the first section well, even if I can't master the whole thing." "That's the spirit," Robert said, but there was something in his tone that didn't sound encouraging. It sounded almost like he was hoping she would struggle. As class ended and students began packing up, Margaret carefully folded her copy of the Chopin Waltz. Her classmates gathered around her, offering support and encouragement. "If you need someone to practice with, I'm happy to help," David offered. "I mean, I can't play it, but I could listen and tell you how it sounds." "That's very sweet," Margaret replied. "I'll probably need all the support I can get." Betty squeezed her shoulder gently. "Remember, dear, it's not about being perfect. It's about showing how much you've learned." As Margaret walked to her car, she wondered what had motivated Robert's decision. Was he genuinely trying to challenge her? Or was there something else going on? Had she somehow given herself away without realizing it? Sitting in her car, she looked at the sheet music again. The irony wasn't lost on her. She was being asked to perform a piece she could play blindfolded. But she had to pretend it was nearly impossible for her. The next 4 weeks were going to require the performance of her lifetime. Not the performance of Chopin's waltz, that would be easy. The real challenge would be performing the role of Margaret the beginner, struggling heroically with a piece just beyond her reach, while hiding the fact that she could play it better than the man who assigned it to her. As she drove home, Margaret realized that Robert had unwittingly given her the perfect opportunity. If she could pull this off, learning the piece well enough to be impressive but not so well as to be suspicious, she might finally be able to establish herself permanently as just another dedicated amateur. The question was, could she resist the urge to show what the music was truly capable of becoming? That night, Margaret sat at her kitchen table with the Chopin sheet music spread before her, even though she didn't need to read it. She'd memorized this piece 25 years ago, back when her fingers were younger and her dreams were bigger. The notes seemed to mock her from the page, familiar friends that she now had to pretend were strangers. After finishing a simple dinner of soup and salad, Margaret moved to her living room. To any visitor, it looked like a normal middle-class home. Comfortable furniture, family photos on the mantel, a small digital keyboard in the corner that she'd bought specifically for her beginner practice sessions. But Margaret walked past all of that to the far wall, where what appeared to be a large decorative screen hid her most precious secret. She folded back the 3 panels of the screen, revealing what lay behind. A magnificent Steinway grand piano, its black surface gleaming even in the soft lamplight. This was her real instrument, the one she'd saved for years to buy, the one that knew all her secrets. The bench creaked softly as she sat down, her posture automatically shifting from Margaret the beginner to the musician she'd spent decades becoming. Her hands found their natural position on the keys, not the careful, deliberate placement Robert taught in class, but the relaxed, confident touch of someone who'd played thousands of hours. She began with scales, her fingers moving in fluid patterns that felt like breathing. C major, D major, A minor. Progressions she could play in her sleep. The muscle memory was so deep it felt like greeting an old friend after a long absence. Then, almost without conscious thought, her hands found the opening measures of the minute waltz. But not the careful,
measured version she would have to perform for the showcase.
This was the piece as Chopin intended it. Sparkling, effervescent, dancing across the keys with a lightness that made it seem easy even though it wasn't. Her fingers flew through the technical passages that had intimidated her classmates. The rapid scales that Robert had described as challenging flowed like water. The intricate harmonies that looked so complex on paper sang out with crystal clarity. As she played, Margaret closed her eyes and let herself remember. The first time she'd performed this piece, she was 16, competing in a state competition. Her teacher had warned her it might be too ambitious, but Margaret had fallen in love with its playful energy. She'd won that day, and the piece had become a lucky charm throughout her career. She remembered playing it at her conservatory audition, her graduation recital, her debut with the symphony. Each performance had revealed new layers of the music, new ways to make it sparkle and dance. Even now, after all these years away from professional performance, Her interpretation was richer and more nuanced than it had ever been, but that was exactly the problem. Margaret forced herself to stop playing and opened her eyes. On the piano's music stand sat a framed photograph from her last professional concert, her in an elegant black gown, taking a bow before a packed concert hall. The audience was on their feet, applauding something they'd never heard before and might never hear again. Next to that photo was another one, her children at their high school graduations, beaming with pride as they hugged their mother. They'd been so young when she'd made the decision to step away from performing, to focus on being present for their teenage years instead of traveling constantly. "You gave up music for us," her daughter had said once, and Margaret had corrected her gently. "I didn't give up music. I chose a different kind of music, the music of being your mom." Now, looking at these photos in the soft light of her living room, Margaret realized she hadn't given up music at all. She'd just learned to play it differently. She returned to the Chopin, but this time she played it as Margaret the beginner would need to learn it. Slowly, deliberately, with careful attention to each note. She forced herself to stumble in places where the fingering would be tricky for someone still learning. She practiced playing with the kind of measured tempo that showed effort rather than ease. It was harder than playing the piece correctly. Every instinct told her to let the music flow, to give it the life and energy it deserved. Instead, she had to restrain herself, to play it well enough to be respectable but not so well as to be suspicious. She spent an hour working on what she mentally called her performance of learning, the careful process of appearing to gradually master difficult passages. She practiced looking puzzled at certain measures, then having breakthrough moments where the fingering suddenly clicked. The irony wasn't lost on her. She was preparing for the most challenging performance of her career, pretending to be amateur at something she'd mastered decades ago. When her phone rang, breaking the silence, Margaret quickly closed the piano lid and folded the screen back into place before answering. "Hi, Mom." Her daughter's voice was bright and cheerful from 3 time zones away. "How are the piano lessons going?" Margaret settled into her favorite chair, looking around her suddenly ordinary living room. "They're going well, sweetheart. We're preparing for a little showcase next month." "That's so exciting. What are you going to play?" Margaret hesitated for just a moment. "The teacher assigned me a Chopin piece. It's pretty challenging, probably more than I'm ready for, but he seems to think I can handle it." "Chopin? Wow, Mom, that sounds serious. I remember you playing Chopin when I was little. You always made it sound so beautiful." The words hit Margaret like a gentle punch to the heart. Her children did remember her music, even though they'd been so young when she'd stepped away from performing. "Well, this will definitely sound different from what you remember," Margaret said with a laugh. "I'm still very much a beginner. I'm sure you'll do great. You always were a perfectionist about everything you tried." After they hung up, Margaret sat in the quiet darkness of her living room. Through the window, she could see other houses on her street, normal people living normal lives, probably getting ready for bed after another ordinary Tuesday. She thought about her classmates, probably at home struggling with their showcase pieces on small keyboards, working through simple melodies with the determination of people discovering something new and wonderful. Then she thought about Robert, and the strange satisfaction in his voice when he'd assigned her the impossible piece. She still couldn't understand his motivation, but she was beginning to realize it didn't matter. What mattered was that she had 4 weeks to figure out how to honor both the music she loved and the friendships she'd found. Margaret returned to her hidden piano one more time that night. She played the Chopin waltz again, not as the virtuoso she'd been, not as the beginner she was pretending to be, but as the person she was now. Someone who'd learned that the most beautiful music wasn't always the most technically perfect, but the most honest. She would find a way to perform this piece that was true to both her past and her present. The question was whether she could do it without losing either the music or the people who'd grown to matter so much to her. As she finally headed to bed, Margaret realized that the next 4 weeks weren't just about learning to play a piece she already knew. They were about learning to be herself, all of herself, in a way she'd never had to before. The real performance was just beginning. The first week of preparation brought unexpected challenges that Margaret hadn't anticipated. During Tuesday's class, when Robert asked each student to play a portion of their showcase piece, Margaret had to carefully calibrate her performance of struggle. She sat at her keyboard, the Chopin music propped in front of her, and began the opening measures. Her fingers wanted to dance through the familiar passages, but she forced them to move hesitantly, pausing occasionally as if double-checking the notes. "I'm having trouble with this section," she said, stopping midway through a phrase that should have been smooth as silk. "The fingering feels awkward." Robert nodded approvingly. "That's exactly the kind of passage that takes repetition. Try breaking it down into smaller pieces." Margaret dutifully practiced the same 4 measures repeatedly, deliberately making different small mistakes each time until she figured out the correct fingering. But as she played, she noticed David watching her intently from his neighboring keyboard. During the break, he approached her with a thoughtful expression. "Margaret, can I ask you something? When you play that piece, even when you make mistakes, it still sounds musical, like you understand what it's supposed to feel like." Margaret's heart skipped, but she kept her voice casual. "I've been listening to recordings online to help me learn it. Maybe that's helping with the musical part, even if my fingers can't keep up yet." "That's smart," David replied, but something in his eyes suggested he wasn't entirely convinced. The following week brought more complications. Betty, always eager to help, had downloaded several different recordings of the Minute Waltz to her phone. "I thought we could listen together during break," she announced cheerfully. "I found one by Vladimir Ashkenazy that's supposed to be wonderful." As the recording played through Betty's small speaker, Margaret had to suppress her reactions. She knew this performance intimately, had studied it years ago, had even met Ashkenazy briefly at a music festival. But she forced herself to listen as if hearing it for the first time. "Wow," she said carefully. "He makes it sound so effortless. I can barely get through the first page." "Don't compare yourself to professional pianists, dear," Betty said kindly. "Just focus on doing your best." But Linda, who had been listening closely, made an observation that sent another chill through Margaret. "You know what's interesting? When Margaret tries to play it slowly, I can almost hear how it would sound at full speed, like she instinctively knows the shape of the music." Margaret forced a laugh. "I think that's just wishful thinking. I'm nowhere near ready for full speed." Robert, who had been eavesdropping from across the room, joined their conversation with a look Margaret was beginning to recognize as suspicious. "How many hours are you practicing at home, Margaret?" he asked. "Maybe 30 minutes a day when I can manage it," she replied honestly. She was practicing 30 minutes a day on her small keyboard, her beginner practice. The hours she spent on her grand piano were a different matter entirely. "And you're using just the keyboard you bought for class?" "Yes, just the little one in my living room. It's perfect for a beginner like me." Robert nodded, but his expression remained thoughtful. "It's remarkable how much you're progressing. Perhaps you have more natural talent than you realize." The word talent hung in the air like a warning. Margaret knew she needed to be more careful. Over the next few classes, she made sure to struggle more visibly. She asked questions about basic music theory that she could have answered in her sleep. She expressed confusion about terminology that any conservatory graduate would know instinctively. "What's a crescendo again?" she asked during one lesson, pointing to a marking in her music. "It means to gradually get louder," Robert explained, his tone suggesting he thought he'd told her this before. Right. I keep forgetting the Italian terms." But her careful performance of ignorance created its own problems. Patricia approached her after class with genuine concern. "Margaret, you seem different lately, more, I don't know, uncertain. Are you feeling overwhelmed by that piece Robert gave you?" The kindness in Patricia's voice made Margaret feel terrible about her deception. These people genuinely cared about her, and here she was lying to them about something so fundamental to who she was. "I guess I am feeling a bit overwhelmed," Margaret admitted. "Sometimes I wonder if Robert assigned me something too difficult." "Well, if anyone can handle it, you can," Patricia said warmly. "You have such a gentle way with music. Even when you make mistakes, there's something beautiful about how you play." That night, Margaret sat at her kitchen table with a cup of tea, thinking about Patricia's words. Even when she was trying to play badly, her love for music came through. The years of training, the deep understanding of how music worked. These things were apparently harder to hide than she'd thought. The situation became more complicated during the 3rd week of preparation. Robert announced that he wanted each student to perform their entire showcase piece during class, as a dress rehearsal. "Don't worry about perfection," he told the group. "This is just so we can identify any last-minute issues that need work." One by one, students performed their pieces. Betty played Amazing Grace with heartfelt emotion despite a few technical stumbles. David managed the entertainer with infectious enthusiasm, even when his rhythm wavered. Linda and Patricia performed their duet version of Mary. Had a little lamb with giggles and obvious joy. Then it was Margaret's turn. She approached her keyboard with visible nervousness, not about playing the piece, but about how to play it convincingly as a struggling amateur. She'd spent hours crafting a performance that showed effort and improvement while maintaining plausible difficulty. As she began the opening measures, Margaret tried to channel the mindset of someone still learning. She played with careful attention to each note, occasionally pausing as if double-checking her fingering. She allowed herself small moments of beautiful phrasing, followed by technical passages that seemed to challenge her. The room grew quiet as she played. Even with her deliberate limitations, the beauty of Chopin's composition shone through. When she finished, there was a moment of silence before enthusiastic applause broke out. "That was beautiful, Margaret," Betty said, her eyes bright with tears. "Really lovely," David added. "You can tell how hard you've been working." But Robert's response was different. He approached her keyboard with an expression that was hard to read. "That was quite impressive," he said slowly. "Much more polished than I expected for someone who's been playing for only a few months." Margaret felt her cheeks flush. "I've been practicing really hard, and I still made several mistakes." "Yes, but your musical instincts are remarkable. The way you shaped certain phrases, the natural rubato you used in the middle section, these are things that usually take years to develop." The word rubato sent a spike of panic through Margaret. She'd used subtle tempo variations without thinking, a natural expression that came from decades of experience. "I'm not sure what rubato means," she said carefully. "I was just trying to make it sound pretty." Robert studied her for a long moment. Rubato is the gentle speeding up and slowing down that makes music sound expressive rather than mechanical. "It's quite advanced for someone at your level." "Oh," Margaret said, trying to look puzzled. "I didn't realize I was doing anything special. I just played what felt right." After class, as students were packing up, Margaret overheard a conversation that made her stomach clench. "There's something about Margaret that doesn't quite add up," she heard Robert saying quietly to another instructor who had stopped by. "She claims to be a complete beginner, but some of her musical choices are surprisingly sophisticated." "Maybe she's just naturally gifted," the other instructor suggested. "Maybe," Robert replied. "Or maybe she's not being entirely honest about her background." Margaret pretended not to hear as she carefully packed away her music, but as she walked to her car that night, she realized that her secret was becoming harder to keep. Robert was growing suspicious, and her genuine love for music kept betraying her efforts to seem amateur. With only 1 week left before the showcase, Margaret faced a dilemma. She could continue trying to hide her abilities and risk being exposed as a fraud, or she could find a way to be more honest without completely destroying the relationship she'd built. As she drove home through the quiet suburban streets, Margaret realized that the most dangerous part wasn't the performance itself, it was the growing pressure of pretending to be someone she wasn't with people who genuinely cared about her. The showcase was supposed to be a celebration of their progress as beginners, but for Margaret it was becoming something much more complicated. A test of whether she could find a way to be truthful about who she was, without losing the ordinary life she'd grown to love. The night before the showcase, Margaret sat at her grand piano with the lights dimmed low, her hands resting motionless on the keys. The house was completely quiet, except for the soft hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen and the distant sound of traffic on the main road. For the first time in weeks, she allowed herself to play the minute waltz exactly as it was meant to be played. Her fingers moved with the confidence of countless hours of practice, the muscle memory so deep it felt like breathing. The music flowed from her hands in crystalline cascades, each note precise yet effortless, the entire piece unfolding like a story she knew by heart. This was who she really was. This was the musician who had spent 20 years on concert stages, who had recorded albums, who had been reviewed in major newspapers and magazines. The woman whose playing had once been described as touching the divine through earthly keys. But as the final notes faded into silence, Margaret found herself thinking not about concert halls and standing ovations, but about Betty's encouraging smile and David's genuine excitement when he finally mastered a difficult passage. She thought about Patricia and Linda's friendship, and how they'd insisted she join them for coffee after class even when she protested she didn't want to impose. These people had welcomed her not because of what she could do, but because of who she seemed to be, a kind, humble woman learning something new and wonderful at middle age. They admired her patience, her willingness to help others, her homemade cookies and gentle encouragement. Would they still feel the same way if they knew she'd been deceiving them for months? Margaret opened the piano bench and pulled out a folder she hadn't looked at in years. Inside were programs from her concerts, newspaper clippings, and photographs from her performing career. Here was a review from the New York Times praising her exceptional technical mastery and profound musical sensitivity. There was a photo of her with a famous conductor after a performance of Rachmaninoff's Third Piano Concerto. She studied the young woman in these photos, elegant in concert gowns, confident at the keyboard, living a life that seemed glamorous and important. That woman had been driven, ambitious, constantly traveling and practicing and pushing herself to new artistic heights. But that woman had also been lonely in ways she hadn't fully understood at the time. The classical music world was small and competitive, filled with people who saw her as a colleague or a rival rather than a friend. Conversations always centered around music. Who was performing where? Which competitions were coming up? What critics had said about this or that performance? Margaret closed the folder and returned it to the bench. She walked to the window and looked out at her quiet neighborhood, where porch lights glowed warmly in windows and families were settling in for the evening. When had she last felt as happy as she did during those Tuesday evening piano classes? When had anyone asked about her children, her hobbies, her thoughts about anything other than music? When had she last sat around a table during break time, sharing stories and laughing about everyday things? The truth was, Margaret Chen, the amateur piano student, had more genuine friendships than Margaret Chen, the concert pianist, had ever had. Her phone rang, interrupting her thoughts. The caller ID showed her daughter's number. "Hi, sweetheart," Margaret answered, settling into her favorite armchair. "Mom, I know it's late, but I couldn't stop thinking about your recital tomorrow." "Are you nervous?" Margaret smiled at hearing it called a recital rather than a showcase. "A little nervous, yes. It's been a long time since I performed for people. Well, not that long. You used to play for us all the time when Kevin and I were kids. That was different. That was just family. Maybe, but you always made it sound magical. I remember sitting on the floor next to the piano bench, watching your hands move. It was like you were casting spells." Margaret felt tears prick her eyes. Her children did remember her music, even though they'd been so young when she'd stepped away from professional performing. "I hope tomorrow goes well," her daughter continued. "I know it's just a community center thing, but I'm proud of you for trying something new. It takes courage to be a beginner at anything." After they hung up, Margaret sat in the darkness thinking about her daughter's words. Courage to be a beginner. Is that what she'd been doing all these months? Not just pretending to be a beginner, but actually having the courage to start over as someone new? She thought about Robert's growing suspicion and his impossible assignment. By now she was certain he suspected something about her background, though she couldn't understand his motivation for essentially setting her up to fail. Did he think she was being dishonest about her experience? Was he trying to expose her? Margaret realized that tomorrow she would have to make a choice. She could continue her careful performance of struggle, playing the piece well enough to be respectable but not so well as to completely give herself away. She could maintain her cover and keep the friendships she'd built, even though they were based on a fundamental deception, or she could tell the truth. The thought terrified her more than any concert performance ever had. These people had grown to care about Margaret the beginner, kind, humble, hard-working Margaret who brought cookies and listened to their stories. Would they still care about Margaret, the former professional? Would they feel betrayed? Would they think she'd been laughing at them all along? But as she sat there in her quiet living room, Margaret began to realize that the person they'd grown to care about wasn't entirely fictional. The kindness was real. The interest in their lives was genuine. The joy she felt in their company was honest. The only lie was about her musical background. She thought about Betty, who had become like a surrogate mother to her, always checking to make sure she was eating well and not working too hard. Betty had shared stories about her late husband, her worries about her health, her dreams of playing piano for her grandchildren. Would knowing about Margaret's professional background really change the affection between them? She thought about David, who had grown more confident over the weeks, partly because Margaret had been so encouraging about his progress. He'd told her that her faith in him had helped him believe in himself. Would he still value that encouragement if he knew it came from someone with decades of experience? Margaret walked back to her piano and sat down again. This time she played the piece as she'd been performing it in class, carefully with deliberate imperfections and moments of uncertainty. But even played this way, her love for the music came through. There was no hiding the depth of her connection to Chopin's beautiful composition. Maybe that was the answer. Maybe she didn't need to choose between her past and her present. Maybe she could find a way to honor both the musician she'd been and the friend she'd become. As midnight approached, Margaret made her decision. Tomorrow's performance would be honest, not about her technical abilities, which she would continue to restrain, but about her relationship with the music itself. She would let her genuine love for Chopin's waltz shine through, even if it raised questions, and if those questions came, she would answer them truthfully. For the first time in months, Margaret felt a sense of peace about who she was and who she was becoming. She wasn't Margaret, the professional pianist, and she wasn't Margaret, the amateur student. She was simply Margaret, someone who loved music deeply and had found something even more precious than applause: genuine human connection. Tomorrow, she would find out if that was enough. As she finally headed to bed, Margaret realized that the most important performance of her life wouldn't be about playing Chopin perfectly. It would be about playing herself honestly, for people who had given her the gift of seeing her as more than just her accomplishments. The music would take care of itself. The question was whether she would have the courage to let it. The community center buzzed with nervous energy as families and friends filled the small auditorium. Margaret stood in the wings, watching through a crack in the curtain as people found their seats. She spotted her classmates' supporters, Betty's daughter and grandchildren in the front row, David's parents looking proud and excited, Linda and Patricia's husbands chatting together. Margaret had invited no one. Her children lived too far away, and she hadn't wanted to explain why their mother was suddenly performing again after years of silence. Tonight she would face this moment alone, which somehow felt appropriate. 5 minutes until we start, Robert announced, gathering his students in the small backstage area. His eyes lingered on Margaret with an expression she still couldn't quite read. Anticipation mixed with something that looked almost like satisfaction. The other students clustered together, sharing last-minute encouragement and nervous jokes. Betty straightened Margaret's collar with motherly concern. "You look lovely, dear. That blue dress is perfect for performing." Margaret had chosen her outfit carefully, elegant enough to show respect for the music, but simple enough to match her image as a dedicated amateur. No sequins or concert gowns tonight. Just a navy blue dress that could have come from any department store. "How are you feeling?" David asked, bouncing slightly on his feet with nervous energy. "Strangely calm," Margaret replied, and realized it was true. After months of careful deception, the prospect of finally being honest felt liberating, even if she wasn't sure exactly how that honesty would emerge. "Places everyone," Robert called out. "Remember, this is a celebration of your progress. Just do your best and enjoy the moment." Betty went first, her amazing grace drawing warm applause from the audience. Despite a few missed notes, her heartfelt interpretation brought several people to tears. David followed with the entertainer, his enthusiasm more than making up for the occasional stumble. Linda and Patricia's duet was charming and playful, their obvious friendship shining through every note. Then Robert stepped to the microphone to introduce Margaret. "Our next performer is Margaret Chen, who joined our class just a few months ago as a complete beginner." His voice carried a slight emphasis on the words that made Margaret's stomach tighten. "She's taken on quite an ambitious piece for tonight, Chopin's Minute Waltz. It's a challenging work that requires considerable technical skill and musical maturity." Margaret heard the subtle challenge in his introduction and understood that Robert was setting the stage for either her triumph or her humiliation. As she walked onto the small stage, she could see her classmates in the front row, their faces bright with encouraging smiles. The piano was an old upright, nothing like the grand instrument she was used to, but Margaret had tested it during rehearsal and found it adequate. She adjusted the bench height and took a moment to center herself. her hands resting lightly on her knees. Looking out at the audience, Margaret saw expectant faces, some curious about this challenging piece they'd heard about, others simply supportive of a fellow community member trying something new. In the front row, Betty gave her an encouraging nod. Margaret placed her hands on the keys and felt the familiar weight of the moment before music begins. For 30 years, this feeling had been as natural as breathing. The slight hush in the room, the sense of anticipation, the knowledge that she was about to create something beautiful. She began with the opening measures exactly as she'd been playing them in class. Carefully, deliberately, with the measured pace of someone still learning. The notes emerged cleanly but without the flowing confidence that marked a professional performance. But as she continued, something began to shift. The music itself seemed to demand more. Chopin's playful melody wanted to dance, wanted to sparkle, wanted to show off its wit and charm. Margaret found herself caught between her careful persona and the irresistible pull of the composition. In the audience, she could see people leaning forward slightly, drawn in by something they couldn't quite name. The piece was being played correctly, but there was something underneath. A current of understanding that suggested the performer knew secrets about this music that went beyond the notes on the page. Margaret reached the middle section, where Chopin's melody becomes more lyrical and expressive. Here, despite all her intentions to maintain her beginner's facade, her true relationship with the music began to emerge. Her touch grew more nuanced, her phrasing more sophisticated. The cheap upright piano seemed to sing under her hands. In the front row, David's expression changed from supportive encouragement to puzzled amazement. Betty's hand went to her heart, as if the music was touching something deep inside her. Even Robert, standing in the wings, looked startled by what he was hearing. As Margaret entered the final section, the technical passages that had supposedly been giving her trouble, she faced her moment of truth. She could continue the careful performance she'd planned, or she could let the music be what it was meant to be. She chose honesty. Her hands suddenly found their true voice. The rapid scales that had been halting and careful became fluid as water. The challenging arpeggios sparkled with crystalline clarity. The playful dialogue between melody and accompaniment danced with wit and sophistication that could only come from decades of understanding. The transformation was breathtaking. This wasn't just someone playing notes correctly. This was a master musician having a conversation with a great composer. Every phrase was shaped with purpose, every dynamic marking honored with precision, every technical passage executed with such ease that it seemed effortless. The audience sat in stunned silence, recognizing that they were witnessing something far beyond what they'd expected. This wasn't a community center recital anymore. This was art. Margaret's posture had changed completely. Gone was the careful, uncertain positioning of a student. In its place was the natural grace of someone who had spent thousands of hours at the piano, someone for whom this instrument was as familiar as her own voice. As she approached the final measures, Margaret allowed herself to smile slightly, not the nervous smile of someone hoping to get through a difficult piece, but the confident joy of a musician who knew she was creating something beautiful. The closing flourish rang out with perfect clarity, each note in its exact place, the entire performance culminating in a moment of pure musical triumph. The silence that followed lasted only a heartbeat before the applause erupted. But this wasn't the polite, encouraging applause of a community showcase. This was the stunned, ecstatic response of people who had just witnessed something extraordinary. Margaret stood and curtsied, not the awkward bow of an amateur, but the graceful acknowledgement of someone who had done this hundreds of times before. The gesture was so natural, so perfectly executed, that it completed the revelation of who she really was. In the front row, Betty was crying openly, not from sentiment but from the overwhelming beauty of what she'd just heard. David sat with his mouth slightly open, trying to process what had just happened. Linda and Patricia looked at each other in amazement, but it was Robert's face that held Margaret's attention as she left the stage. His expression had cycled through shock, embarrassment, and what looked like dawning recognition. As the applause continued, he stepped forward to the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice slightly shaky, "I think we've just discovered that our Margaret has been somewhat modest about her musical background." Margaret stopped at the edge of the stage, knowing that this was the moment when everything would change. She could continue to try to explain it away, or she could finally tell the truth. She chose truth. Walking back to center stage, Margaret took the microphone from Robert's hand. The applause gradually quieted as the audience sensed that something important was about to happen. "Thank you," she said simply, her voice carrying the calm confidence that came from years of speaking to audiences. "I think I owe you all an explanation." Margaret stood at the microphone, looking out at the faces of people who had become so important to her over the past few months. The auditorium was completely quiet, everyone waiting to understand what they had just witnessed. "My name is Margaret Chen," she began, her voice steady but gentle. "And I haven't been entirely honest with you about who I am." She paused, gathering her thoughts and her courage. In the front row, Betty's tear-streaked face was full of concern and curiosity rather than anger. "For 23 years, I was a professional concert pianist. I performed with major orchestras, recorded albums, and spent most of my adult life on stages much bigger than this one." Margaret's voice carried no pride or boasting, just simple fact. "But when my children were teenagers, I made the decision to step away from that world. I wanted to be present for their lives in a way that constant traveling and performing wouldn't allow." The audience listened with rapt attention. In the wings, Robert stood frozen, finally understanding the full scope of what had just happened. "When my kids left for college last year, I found myself with time on my hands for the first time in decades. I missed music terribly, but I also missed something else. I missed being around people who didn't know what I used to do, who could just see me as a regular person trying something new." Margaret looked directly at her classmates as she continued. "So I signed up for beginner piano lessons, not because I needed to learn piano, but because I needed to learn how to be ordinary, how to make friends who weren't in the music world, how to be valued for who I am rather than what I can do." Betty reached out and squeezed David's hand, both of them beginning to understand. "Every Tuesday night for the past few months, you welcomed me into your group. You shared your stories, your struggles, your victories. You cared about me not because I could play Chopin, but because I listened when you talked about your grandchildren, or brought cookies, or helped with fingering exercises." Margaret's voice grew warmer as she spoke. "You gave me something I had never experienced in my professional life. Genuine friendship with no agenda, no competition, no expectations beyond just showing up and being kind to each other." She turned slightly toward Robert, her expression understanding rather than accusatory. "I think our instructor suspected something wasn't quite right about my background. And he was correct to be suspicious. I was lying about something fundamental. But I want you to know that everything else was true. My enjoyment of our classes, my respect for all of your hard work, my gratitude for your friendship. All of that was completely real." The audience began to murmur softly, processing this revelation. Margaret held up her hand gently to continue. "When Robert assigned me the Chopin waltz, I think he knew he was creating a moment of truth. He could have exposed me, but instead he gave me the opportunity to choose honesty for myself. Tonight I decided it was time to stop hiding." She looked back at her classmates, her voice becoming more personal. "I hope you can forgive me for the deception. I never meant to mock your efforts or make light of your learning process. If anything, watching you discover the joy of music for the first time reminded me why I fell in love with piano in the first place." Betty stood up from her seat in the front row, her face bright with emotion. "Oh, my dear girl," she called out, "there's nothing to forgive. You brought us cookies and kindness every week. You helped us with our playing and listened to our stories. That's who you are, not what you used to do for work." Her words broke the tension in the room. David jumped up and started applauding, followed quickly by Linda and Patricia. Soon the entire auditorium was on its feet, applauding not just the performance but the honesty and vulnerability Margaret had shown. As the applause died down, Robert stepped forward and took the microphone. His face showed a mixture of embarrassment and newfound respect. "I owe Margaret an apology," he said, his voice humble. "I suspected she had more experience than she was letting on, and instead of talking to her privately, I tried to catch her in her deception by giving her an impossible piece. I was being petty and unprofessional." He turned to face Margaret directly. "What I didn't understand was that you were seeking something more valuable than musical instruction. You were seeking community, and judging by the reaction tonight, you found it. In the weeks that followed, Margaret's revelation brought changes, but not the ones she had feared. Instead of feeling betrayed, her classmates seemed even more drawn to her. Betty invited her to family dinners, where Margaret found herself playing simple songs for the grandchildren and sharing stories about her, performing days that made them laugh and gasp with wonder. David asked if she would give him some extra help with technique, leading to coffee meetings where they talked as much about his job and her children as they did about piano. Linda and Patricia insisted she join their book club, saying they valued her perspective on things that had nothing to do with music. Most surprisingly, Robert approached her about becoming a co-instructor for the advanced students who were ready for more challenging repertoire. "I've learned something important," he told her. "Technical skill means nothing without the ability to connect with people. You have both, and you understand what music can mean in ordinary lives." Margaret accepted the teaching position, but insisted on continuing as a student in the beginner class as well. "I'm still learning," she explained. "Just not what you might expect." The community center's piano program flourished under their joint leadership. Margaret brought a depth of musical knowledge that elevated everyone's playing, while Robert provided structure and formal pedagogy. But more importantly, Margaret brought the understanding that music wasn't about perfection or competition. It was about connection and joy. 6 months later, at the next showcase, Margaret performed again. This time she played a simple arrangement of "The Water is Wide," a folk song that allowed her to demonstrate musical beauty without technical showmanship. But she wasn't the only one whose playing had transformed. Betty's hymns had gained depth and expression. David's popular songs swung with new confidence, and Linda and Patricia's duets sparkled with sophisticated musicality. After the performance, as they all gathered for cake and coffee in the community center lobby, Betty pulled Margaret aside. "You know, dear, I've been thinking about what you said that night, about learning to be ordinary, but I don't think that's what happened at all." Margaret looked at her questioningly. "I think you learned to be extraordinary in a completely different way. Not the kind of extraordinary that gets your name in programs, but the kind that makes people feel valued and heard and cared for. That's rarer than perfect technique and much more important." As Margaret looked around the room at her friends, her real friends, who knew her whole story now and loved her anyway, she realized Betty was right. She hadn't given up her musical gifts when she stepped away from performing. She had simply found a new way to use them. The young woman in those old concert photos had been talented and accomplished, but she had been performing for strangers. The woman she was now played for people who knew her favorite coffee order, who called when she had a cold, who celebrated her birthday with homemade cards and terrible singing. Margaret Chen had spent decades learning to play piano perfectly, but it had taken her 50 years to learn to play it with love. Not just love for the music, but love for the people she was sharing it with, and that, she realized, was the most beautiful music of all. As the evening wound down and people began to head home, Margaret sat at the old upright piano and played one last song, a gentle lullaby she'd learned from her grandmother years ago. Her classmates gathered around, some humming along, others just listening with contentment. This was her concert hall now. These were her audience, and this simple community center piano, surrounded by friends who had chosen to love her exactly as she was, felt more like home than any grand stage ever had. The music continued long after the last note faded, echoing in the connections she'd built and the honesty she'd finally found the courage to embrace. Margaret Chen had learned that the most important performance of her life wasn't about playing perfectly. It was about living authentically, with people who valued her heart as much as her hands. And in that small community center room, filled with the warmth of genuine friendship and the lingering echoes of music made with love, she had found everything she'd been searching for.